Very kind of you, and yeah, I'm happy to be here, and happy to follow the excellent and comprehensive survey of American politics and energy and climate policy situation in the U.S. It makes my job pretty easy. Um, I think I'm going to take a pretty different approach here. I just have some spoken comments, not overly lengthy. And then hopefully we can have some discussion and commentary, comments from the audience on some of these issues. First, just for a little context on me, as was said in the brief bio. I do a lot on environmental accounting and greenhouse gas accounting and what we call measurement reporting and verification systems. Um, at all levels. My original work was all at the national level, under Kyoto and then Paris Agreement reporting and compliance tracking. But here I'm going to be talking on one of the bullets that Dale talked about, which is very relevant at this time, and especially in the U.S. And that's the role of you'd call it non-state actors, private sector, and subnational. Although I think I'll focus most on private sector, and we can discuss subnational, so the provincial or state and local government actions. That's going to need to clearly fill in during this, I guess, coming political period. Um, but let me step back from that for a second and just say I approach all of these issues with a focus on policy design and kind of policy metrics. So how do we do the analysis and develop the policy mechanisms to efficiently do greenhouse gas mitigation? A lot of it is first you need to understand the emissions, understand the potential impact of different policies or mitigation actions, and then build that understanding and those metrics into the policy so that the incentives are right, or the whatever form it is. The recognition is right. In the case of the kind of voluntary action and corporate ESG action. A key thing to understand is obviously on that side, typically on the private sector side, unless they're complying with specific regulation, a lot of what we see happening in the U.S. and in Europe, at least, and in other parts of the world to probably a little bit lesser extent, is big private sector organizations, companies are looking for recognition for being climate leaders, for being environmental leaders. And that's really what's driving the action. You especially see that in, larger companies with more of a sort of public brand exposure, as well as, so that's kind of the external driver. And you also see it a lot in big tech companies, the Googles, the Microsoft, the Amazons, where I find it an interesting dynamic, because some of those companies are here in Seattle, where I live, is they're oftentimes competing to, at least appear to be more green, more climate friendly, taking more climate action, because they're competing for staff, high paid, high in demand computer programmers and experts in the software industry. And there's a really vigorous competition for those staff across all these big tech firms. And one of the ways they compete is by wanting to at least appear or be perceived as a company that's good, that's not evil, that's doing good things, is green. You see that here, especially in the Seattle area and what we call the Bay Area, the San Francisco, Silicon Valley area. There's a strong competition for being seen as a green company. And an example being, large companies are just spending, meaningful chunks of money on what we call CDR, the carbon dioxide removal. So just funding essentially big scrubbers in Iceland and other places. There's other technologies of like capturing and CO2 from the air and pumping it underground, paying hundreds or thousands of dollars a ton, um, just out of philanthropically almost, just to be able to say that they're help supporting climate carbon dioxide removal, which is great. It's like it's shifting technology, but you can see the nature of the things here of the competition that some of these companies are having to appear green. So anyway, so that's the kind of context of kind of some of the comments I'm gonna have on that space of kind of climate action. It's not the most important space. I actually think it's probably one of the least important spaces, but in a time where at least in the U.S. we're going to almost surely see a retrenchment in federal action. Um, the expectation is, you know, the expectations are going to rise for these non-state corporate actors. The way I think about these things, I don't have as many years of experience as Dale, but I did start at EPA in 1995, sort of leading up to the Kyoto negotiations. We probably were, I mean, Waterside Mall. I'm sure that means something to you.
Of course.
Um, yeah, those are PTSD nightmares that we don't want to talk about that anymore. That's inside baseball, sick building syndrome days. Um, but and that was during the Bill Clinton administration. And then, like Dale, we've seen lots of roller coasters on the climate front. Pretty often correlated with the change of presidential administration. So we see like a lot of action, at the national level, and then administration changes and everything. I don't want to say everything collapses, but there's retrenchment. And then, the party administration changes, and then you see a bump again, and it's easy to market, Bush, Obama, um, Trump, Biden, it goes on. And so, we've ridden these roller coasters in the US a number of times now, starting with Kyoto and then withdrawal from Kyoto and onward. But counter cyclical to that, each time the federal momentum wanes, you see this pickup in local government, state government, increasingly voluntary corporate activity. Um, and and that, I mean, we'll see that again this time. I have a few thoughts that I'll kind of maybe conclude with on whether or not um, there might be something different about this cycle of the federal government pulling back and corporations stepping up, but it's to be determined. But anyway, that's the way I approach it. Is we see this cycle. The challenging thing about this is, I mean, I'm not one to say that there's somehow a deadline for us to act on climate change, but time is running out, right? Um, so, um, it's just the normal kind of give and take of politics. Like that can't go on forever if we want sort of a stable climate down the road. So I think that is gonna affect the dynamic here to some degree. So having said all that, and sort of recognizing this roller coaster or yo-yo, whatever you want to call it, um, um, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the big debates that are going on within specifically this kind of corporate voluntary action space, that I won't necessarily entirely determine how it develops, but I think is significantly shaping how it's developing right now. And this comes through some of my experience working on the Science-Based Target Initiative and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and just talking to lots of companies and being kind of active in that space, trying to help set. Mainly, my work is more setting the standards and the protocols for that space. And the first one is, I assume a number of you have heard about science-based targets or net zero targets and things like that. which is very in vogue in this in the business community these days, or in certain parts of the business community. Um, right now, there's a really, I guess, intense debate on what that means. I mean, companies have been declaring they're setting science-based targets and net zero targets for a number of years now, and it's really ramped up just in the last few years. But the truth is, there's far from a consensus or like a unified standard for even what that means. We've seen some companies set those targets and commit to them and then withdraw because they realized they didn't really know what they committed to, and they didn't know how they were going to meet it. Um, and so, trying to kind of I guess you'd say, put the meat on the bones, or make it more specific so that, we go from just performative net zero and science-based, targets to like concrete, like meaningful, trackable targets. Um, that is an ongoing argument going on right now. There's new a new guidance and standards being written under SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, as well as ISO 14060, as well as other initiatives to try and figure that out. And there's a number of tense issues within that space. One is around what we call kind of value chain greenhouse gas accounting. Some people call it scope 3. The idea being that a company should take responsibility for emissions occurring in it, from its suppliers as well as from its customers, so up and downstream in its value chain. Obviously, for a lot of companies in the U.S., that's going to involve, their upstream supply chain involves a lot of Chinese companies, and vice versa. And there are big debates about like how far up in the value chain or supply chain, and how far down in terms of their customer base, does the corporate responsibility for reducing emissions go? Um, uh, the existing ways of approaching it have been, well, companies should go as far as they could possibly imagine, like to their supplier. And it effectively almost never ends. There's no, and now companies are realizing we don't know how to do that. Like we don't even know what those emissions are that far up our supply chain, much less be able to like track them and reduce them, and then know whether or not they were reduced. And so we're being asked to set a target for something that we don't even understand, and have no way to understand in any practical sense. Um, um, so I guess there's what is it? You would say things are becoming real, as we might say in the US, meaning that instead of, you know, now that the expectations on companies are getting high because climate change is no longer way far out in the future, and because of the politics of things, the expectations of what companies are doing are being elevated. They're now realizing, they actually have to like meet these targets, or they're being expected to actually meet these targets, not just act like they're going to do something. Um, and 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 therefore then the measurements and the kind of the ways you'd say kind of voluntary compliance is judged matters a lot. Um, and so that's one big debate, and it's kind of reshaping the way kind of corporate responsibility and accountability is getting framed, and it's far from being resolved. Far from being resolved. Um, another sort of ongoing debate is around offsetting. So I'm sure many of you have heard about, carbon offsets or carbon credits. The idea about, either you can like buy them, before you get on the plane, or support some sort of forestry project somewhere. The vast majority of this kind of credit market, and I'm speaking primarily about what we call the voluntary credit market. So these are the credits that companies buy just to be able to claim that they're offsetting their emissions. Um, this is an active market that's sort of going through a little bit of a boom and bust cycle right now. And so there's a number of questions with these with these credits. Um, One is well, whether or not we should have them at all, but especially around just their environmental integrity. There's been a good number of stories in the media and various newspapers around the world about whether this forestry project in this country is, basically, a scam. They're not really actually, there's no additional trees being grown or deforestation being prevented. It was all gonna happen anyway. Um, um, or this landfill was going to be required to cap and capture its methane anyway, and so that you shouldn't get credit for doing that. Stories like that, all that's really I guess damaged the credibility of that market, especially more recently. But there's many companies that have I guess are counting on the use of those credits to offset their emissions and therefore claim to be net zero and meeting their targets, or meeting their science-based target, however they framed it. Um, um, and so you've got a real I guess challenge here. And so there's been a number of efforts to try and what we say shore up or support these offset credit markets recently, different quality assurance mechanisms, credit rating agencies of a certain type have formed in that space. Um, but it's still unclear whether or not there's some that think this is going to become trillion-dollar market, and others that think it just needs to go away. Um, and companies are still trying to, they're driven by what they can get recognition for primarily, and they don't want to be associated with something that's being discredited. I mean, that's counter to their whole purpose of doing this. But yet again, like I said, they're oftentimes relying on these credits in order to meet their targets. So it should be pretty obvious what the tension is. One of the uh, topics that I guess we'd say is new in the space um, is what we call contribution versus compensation debate around corporate action and carbon credits, carbon offsetting. And the way I described about carbon offsets is what we'd call compensation based, which is like a company is buying these credits to compensate for the emissions that they're currently releasing through their operations. And that's been how it's been normally framed. This goes all the way back actually to EPA and wetland banking and things like that, where you could get credits for destroy a wetland here, and you can create one over there and get a credit for it to offset or compensate for it. And there's been many cases of mechanisms like this over time through yeah, air pollution cap and trade and other things. Um, uh, but in a voluntary context, it takes on a different meaning because, again, um, there isn't a cap on these companies. They're just voluntarily committing to doing something. And so a number of folks, including me to some degree, have argued that the better way to think about this is what we call a contribution model. So a company would still have its target to reduce its emissions, um, uh, but then they can also buy credits and do other kinds of actions, maybe, with in other parts of the world or other parts of their broader value chain, and get recognition for contributing to global mitigation. And there's a whole sort of kind of metrics and accounting questions on how that's done. But yeah, and a reason this is formed is sort of like for this kind of contribution framing comes from two drivers. One is sort of the moral driver that I guess many activists and many folks that are kind of demanding companies take accountability for emissions, is that a company shouldn't be able to just buy their way out of their responsibility for polluting, for releasing greenhouse gas emissions. They shouldn't be able to just continue to emit and then just buy these credits as if it's all fine. And then, I mean, it's a moral argument. You can debate about the technical justification behind it, and happy to do so in Q&A. But that's the framing. The other issue relates to actually the Paris Agreement. So as everyone here probably knows, one of the new elements of the Paris Agreement was that all countries took on some form of target, a nationally determined contribution. Um, uh, and so in that sense, if a company funds an offset project in some other country, um, and then claims those credits to offset their emissions, effectively that emission reduction will also be accounted for toward the country's target. Um, and so some will argue that there's double counting here, like essentially the company is essentially kind of, you would say, I'm not my words, but others were like stealing the low-hanging fruit, stealing the easy reductions from these other countries and making it harder for them to meet their target. Um, um, Others, argue that companies shouldn't sort of be getting credit or recognized for something that a country is already supposed to be doing, meaning they've already committed to do it. They've already committed to reduce emissions by this amount. A company should not be able to claim that, what a country is already doing. Um, and then, so that within the Paris Agreement, there's this provision called corresponding adjustments. So the idea being is that if you take sort of a credit out of a country, that you're supposed to adjust their emissions accounting, their target, so that they have to, essentially do more because because someone else is counting that reduction that was transferred. And that's led to a whole tense debate on when and where those kinds of corresponding adjustments are appropriate or not appropriate. Um, are countries, I mean, are companies simply kind of helping contribute to national NDCs, or are they being expected to go beyond what the countries have already committed to doing? Um, and again, and you can see how a company that's trying to just like do, meet its own target, and being told that they need to like wade into this like tense Paris Agreement, Article 6 compliance debate on crediting. It's freaking out a lot of companies that they're being told that there's uncertainty here, and they may have to go get permission from some other country somewhere else to be able to claim a credit. Um, so those are a couple. Another one that um, I feel is pretty ripe in the U.S. and Europe, um, is the corporate disclosure being made mandatory. Corporate disclosure of climate risk, and within climate risk, corporate emissions. Um, this is already happened in Europe, in the EU. There's already a law on the books in California, and there's proposed regulatory rule at the federal level here in the US. This primarily comes from securities or financial regulatory bodies around for securities and investor risk protection and disclosure. And the idea being is companies should specifically, disclose to investors the kind of risks they face due to climate change. Um, and I'll just focus on the greenhouse gas sort of mitigation side of that, because there's broader risks about like what risks are in due to weather, extreme weather, or flooding and other things. So what we call physical risks. Um, but there's also what we would call, it's different names, but transition risk or a regulatory risk, meaning that what sort of costs or regulatory implications might a company face because we need to essentially, decarbonize the economy. And the kind of assumed expectation is that by a company disclosing its, essentially corporate carbon footprint, that will provide investors useful information to evaluate these sorts of, client investor risks, this transition risk or regulatory risks. And the problem is there, including places where this has already become law, is that the protocols for companies disclosing emissions were in no way built in a way that they're intended to be used as a measure of risk exposure, corporate risk exposure. Um, Matter of fact, it's not that hard to show that there's probably almost no correlation between what companies report, in terms of their emissions data to, variety of non-state actors like the CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. But that's just not going to be that's not correlated with climate risk. You could design kind of corporate disclosure rules that are a reasonable measure of risk that would be useful for investors, but that's just not what it was done. And so there's how would you say, like, there's going to be a coming tense debate around that fact of like how do we design these disclosure rules so that it is a legitimate measure of risk. Um, and then lastly, I was going to just talk for a minute about and then just open up for questions. Um, it's like is I started at the beginning. Is this time like is it different? Are we just in another kind of ride on the roller coaster, or at least part of the roller coaster of up and down of politics and climate action? Um, and I'm not sure. I mean, quite possible we are. At the risk of being pessimistic, it's hard to come up with a hopeful scenario where 1.5 degrees is still on the table. Um, and uh, but I think we're also heading to a period where the expectations on what companies need to be doing are going to be extremely high going into these next 4 years. Um, and at the same time, companies are if you talk to them internally, their sustainability teams, they're like, this is like becoming overwhelming. Like there's so many things we have to report on. We don't know how we're supposed to do this stuff. We don't know how we're supposed to take actions. Even when we do take actions, we don't, the systems aren't set up to actually recognize the impact of the actions we're taking. And so, um, there's a real, I guess, um, uh, I think a tense period coming up where there's going to have to be some kind of reconciliation of some kind. Some companies are the way they're dealing with it is just stepping back and just what I guess term is called green hushing. They're just trying to hide from the whole thing because they feel like they're in a no-win situation. If they try and do something, they're going to get criticized for not doing enough or not doing it well or not doing it with environmental integrity. And if they, don't do it, don't, do less and just focus on what they can do, in a sort of in a more simplified way, then they're going to be, criticized for not doing more. So they're just like basically trying to hide. Um, a number of companies that are trying to stick with these targets. They're increasingly, a lot of them have interim commitments in 2030. And they're starting to realize that they don't, especially giving some of these debates I talked about, they don't know, they don't think they're going to be able to meet those. And then what happens at that point, when essentially they made commitments, they eventually have to, publicly admit that they're not going to meet them. And then what does that mean for the whole kind of architecture of kind of corporate climate action? Um, so I would say it's a very tense time. So right as we need corporates to step up, they are nervous about doing so, for other reasons than just politics. Um, uh, and then lastly, I don't think I could even come close to competing with Dale's excellent sort of summary of opportunities and possibilities for the relationship with China. But I would just echo that I think now, obviously, if or it should be obvious, is an opportunity for Chinese leadership on this topic. Um, given the state or the likely state of the U.S. over the next couple of years, and um, hopefully that hopefully that is taken advantage of, um, um, and and then hopefully other foreign policy issues don't overwhelm that. But I think the global business community and the global community, environmental community, I think um, would be excited to see, and celebrate a Chinese leadership on this issue if they can. And I'll stop there.